A local pastor now facing continuous sexual assault of a child. According to official documents, Robert L. Carter repeatedly raped a young family member, even impregnating her.
Tonight, her father is speaking only to our Devin Clark, who is live outside of HBD headquarters with further details. Devin.
I got to tell you, this warrant states that the rapes started when this girl was just 7 years old and lasted well into her late teens, happening at least 600 times with a felony charge now filed. The alleged victim's father is speaking out, but we do want to warn you, what you're about to hear may be extremely disturbing.
She had been around this monster since she was about 6 years old.
This man asked not to be identified as to protect his daughter's identity. That isn't stopping him from speaking out about this man, 39-year-old Robert L. Carter, who he says was a family member to his daughter.
So he's always been big to her, and I had to realize that she'd been fearful.
The man whose profile on the Black Preachers Network website has him listed as a bishop and senior pastor is now an accused rapist.
I don't understand, how you can carry yourself or walk around preaching the word and living, a lie.
According to Carter's arrest warrant filed last month, the abuse began back in 2008 when the victim was 7 years old. It states he would go in her room and make her perform a sex act on him on a nightly basis.
How? How could you even get aroused? It doesn't make any sense.
The warrant states the abuse got worse over the years and that it would happen in multiple locations, including their home when everyone was asleep, Carter's grandmother's home, and behind an H-E-B in the parking lot before dropping the victim off at school. The document also states that Carter would bring the victim here to the Greater Bible Way Church in Sunnyside, where he had an office, and rape her.
She's had an episode where she ended up in the hospital. For psychiatric reasons.
When she was 17, the warrant states she secretly had Carter's baby.
What if she would have died that night? She had the baby in the closet by herself. And he came and got the baby and took the baby to a fire station and dropped the baby off.
With many questions, we went to Carter's address listed on the warrant. But no one seemed to be home, so we called him.
The person you are calling is not available. Record your message at the tone.
No answer. While the warrant has been filed, we understand that Carter has not been taken into custody at this time. As for the baby mentioned in the story, the father you heard from says his daughter is in the process of trying to get the child back. Reporting live outside of HBD headquarters tonight, Devin Clark, KPRC 2 News.
This is the story of a man who preached about righteousness but lived in the shadows of sin. A man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, delivering sermons about faith, morality, and the fear of God. Yet behind closed doors, he committed unspeakable acts. His congregation called him pastor, leader, mentor, and a man of God. But today, the world knows him for what he truly is: a predator, a liar, and an accused rapist. This story takes us to Houston, Texas, where a shocking case has unfolded, one that exposes the terrifying reality of how power, trust, and blind faith can be the perfect shield for monsters. This is the story of Pastor Robert L. Carter, a man whose secret lifestyle negates what he preaches and the image he portrays to the world. You're watching True Crime Stories 24/7. Thanks for joining. Please do well to subscribe and like this video to support us. Before we get into the details of this story, permit me to ask you this. How much do you really know about the people you trust? Or should I rather ask, how much should we trust people around us? Think about it. Every day we put our faith in people, our teachers, our doctors, our bosses, our religious leaders. We assume that because they hold a position of authority, because they wear a suit, a robe, or in this case, stand before a congregation with a Bible in their hands, they must be good, righteous, and incapable of harm. But history has shown us over and over again that predators don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they stand in broad daylight, shaking our hands, praying over our family, preaching words of salvation while hiding the darkest of secrets. Now, let me ask you something even deeper. If someone you trusted with your life, with your faith, was accused of something heinous, would you believe it? Or would you do what so many others have done? look for excuses, say it must be a lie, a misunderstanding, and a smear campaign, right? That's exactly what happened when this pastor's case broke. Some people refused to believe it. They defended him. They called it an attack on the church, an attack on Christianity itself. But here's the truth. This is not an attack on faith. This is about a man who used faith as a cover for the evil he committed. And what he did was worse than you can imagine. The victim in this story was a little girl, just 7 years old. The age when she should have been playing with dolls, watching cartoons, learning how to read. But instead, she was living a nightmare that lasted over a decade. From the time she was 7 until she was 19, this man, the so-called pastor, raped her over 600 times. Did you hear that? 600 times. This was not a one-time incident. This was not a moment of weakness. This was calculated, repeated, endless abuse. And what makes this even more horrific is that he wasn't just some stranger. He was a family member, someone who was supposed to protect her, guide her, and be a role model in her life. Instead, he destroyed it. Now imagine this. Every single night, this little girl would lie awake in her bed, knowing that at some point he was going to come into her room. She didn't have a choice. She didn't have the power to stop it. It wasn't just in the house. It happened at his grandmother's home. It happened behind an H-E-B grocery store in the parking lot. It even happened inside the church where he preached. Yes, you heard that right. This man was so bold, so confident that he would never be caught, that he raped her inside the very walls where people came to worship. This girl had no one to run to, no one to tell, because the pastor made sure of it. He threatened her. He told her, "No one will believe you. And if you do tell, I'll tell them you came to me. I'll make your life a living hell." And when that didn't work, he tried bribery. He would offer her candy, little gifts, as if that could erase what he was doing to her. But it didn't stop there. Because as the years went by, the abuse escalated. It got worse. When she turned 12 years old, he started raping her. No more coercion, no more games, no more bribing her to gain access to her body. Just full-blown, monstrous evil. And this became her life, every single day. If you are enjoying this story, please show us some love by subscribing to this channel. Like and share this video if you found it helpful. This is how you can support us in continuing to bring you more stories. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button now and turn on the notifications so you don't miss our next story. With that said, let's continue. Now let me pause for a second. If you're still watching this, if you're still here, I want you to imagine what this does to a child's mind. How do you wake up every morning knowing the same horror awaits you that night? How do you go to school and pretend everything is normal? How do you smile when your soul is being crushed every single day? By the time this girl was 16, her body had enough proof of what had been happening all along. She was pregnant. Pregnant with her rapist's child. And she had no one to turn to, no mother to cry to, no father to protect her, no teacher to notice. Nothing. She was all alone in this misery. Eventually, she gave birth. Alone. A 16-year-old girl, raped by a pastor for nearly a decade, gave birth alone in a closet. No doctors, no medical care, no one by her side. Just her pain, and a baby that never asked to be born into this nightmare. Now tell me, what kind of world do we live in where something like this can happen and go unnoticed for so long? Where a child can be suffering in silence, and no one around her has any idea? Or worse, some people do suspect, but they choose to look the other way because it's too uncomfortable to believe. This little girl gave birth in a closet, in the dark, with no one to help her. And when it was over, the pastor came. He took the baby, wrapped it in a blanket, walked out the door, drove to a fire station and dropped the baby off, like garbage, like something disposable. Then he got back into his car and continued his life as if nothing happened. And for this girl, she was left behind, alone, broken. A teenager, now a mother, with no baby in her arms. This, my friends, is the reality of what happens when power protects predators, when faith is weaponized to silence victims, when communities refuse to open their eyes to the evil standing right in front of them. The assault continues afterward, and the secret stays hidden until years later, when the girl finally finds the courage to speak, that the truth came out. The father of the girl, when he learned the truth, was shattered. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could I not have known? How did I not see the signs? These were the questions that haunted him. And the moment he realized that the monster who had destroyed his daughter's life was a trusted member of his own family, he knew what had to be done. He called the police. And just like that, the walls around Pastor Robert L. Carter's carefully built facade began to crumble. This was no longer a secret. This was no longer something he could cover up with his sermons, his smiles, and his so-called reputation. The truth was out. When the world finally found out what he had done, the reaction was explosive. The community was in shock. His congregation was divided. Some people refused to believe it, insisting, "This must be an attack on the church." Others were angry, disgusted, and heartbroken. And then came the big question. Would he be held accountable? Would justice finally be served? Because let's be honest, we've seen cases like this before. We've seen powerful men walk free because of who they are, and because of the influence they hold. So, what happened next? Did Robert L. Carter finally pay for his crimes? Or did he, like so many others, slip through the cracks of the justice system? The answer? It's coming. Stay with me, because the twists in this case are far from over. The moment the truth left the lips of this girl, everything changed. For years, she had carried the weight of this secret, too terrified to speak, too broken to believe that anyone would ever listen. But now it was out in the open. Her father knew. The authorities knew. And eventually, the world knew the name, Robert L. Carter, not as a pastor, not as a man of faith, but as the man who had committed one of the most unthinkable betrayals imaginable. But knowing the truth and proving it? Those were two very different battles. Because even when the facts are staring people in the face, even when the victim has suffered for more than a decade, there are always those who refuse to see. Always those who will defend the accused, not because they truly believe in his innocence, but because accepting the truth would mean confronting something too horrifying to bear. That the person they trusted, the person they looked up to, was never who they thought he was. And so, when this case broke, the reaction was divided. On one side, there were those who were horrified, disgusted, and enraged. They demanded justice. They wanted answers. How could this have gone on for so long? How did no one notice? How did he get away with it for over a decade? But on the other side, denial. People say, "This must be a misunderstanding. He's a pastor, a man of God. He would never do something like this." Others claimed it was a plot, a setup to destroy his reputation, an attack on the church, a personal vendetta. They refused to believe the evidence. They refused to acknowledge the pain of the victim. Instead, they turned to excuses, justifications, anything that would allow them to hold on to the lie they had been living in for years. But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't care whether you believe it or not. It exists. And in this case, it was irrefutable. Because the investigation had hard evidence. Forensic experts, detectives, medical professionals, they knew what had happened. They had records. They had testimonies. They had DNA results that could not be ignored. And when they presented those findings, there was no room left for doubt. The authorities wasted no time. A warrant was issued, and the hunt for Robert L. Carter officially began. But here's where things take a turn. When law enforcement showed up at the address listed on the warrant, expecting to bring him in, expecting to place him in handcuffs and finally hold him accountable, he was nowhere to be found. His home was empty, his phone was disconnected, and his church was closed. The man who had spent over a decade walking freely, who had stood before his congregation every Sunday, preaching about righteousness, had vanished. And now a new question arose. Was he on the run? Because let's not forget, he knew what he had done. He knew that if he stepped into a courtroom, if the evidence was laid bare, if the victim was given the chance to speak, there would be no escaping the truth. So he decided to flee, and perhaps someone helped him hide. For days, investigators searched. They reached out to family, former church members, and anyone who might know where he had gone. Meanwhile, the media had caught wind of the case, and soon his face was everywhere on news stations and social media. And then, just as suddenly as he had disappeared, he resurfaced. But not in the way you might think. He didn't turn himself in. He didn't make a statement proclaiming his innocence or begging for forgiveness. No, he sent out a message that would ignite even more controversy. Instead of showing remorse, instead of acknowledging what he had done, he played the victim. Through a legal representative, he released a statement saying that he was being unfairly targeted, that this was an attempt to ruin his reputation, that false accusations were being spread against him to tarnish his legacy as a man of faith. Imagine, after everything, after the years of evidence, the victim's suffering, the DNA test that proved the child was his response was not to admit fault, not to express guilt or regret, but to frame himself as the one being wronged. And for some, it worked. There were still people defending him. Still, people refusing to believe that their beloved pastor could be capable of something so monstrous. They clung to hope, to faith, to the idea that surely this had to be some kind of mistake. But the authorities, they weren't fooled. They kept searching. And finally, after days of unanswered calls, after media pressure, after relentless pursuit, he was found. And this time, there was no escaping. Law enforcement moved in, and when they placed those handcuffs on his wrists, when they escorted him into the patrol car, when the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, he didn't say a word. The reality of what has just befallen him must have been setting in at that moment. He was no longer a pastor, no longer a man of God, no longer the respected leader he had once pretended to be. He was now an accused criminal, a man facing the consequences of his actions. And as he was driven away, as his mugshot was taken, as the booking process began, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Now came the real fight. Now he would have to stand trial, face his victim, and answer for the pain he had caused, for the childhood he had stolen, and for the trust he had broken. And for the people who had once defended him, they would soon be forced to face the truth. The doors of the courtroom creaked open. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that grips you and that makes your heart beat just a little faster. This was it, the moment of truth. Robert L. Carter, once the revered pastor, the trusted family member, the man who had spent over a decade living a lie, was finally here. Just that this time, there was no pulpit to stand behind, no Bible to hide behind, no congregation to blindly defend him. No, this time he stood before a judge, facing the harsh reality of the evidence stacked against him. And sitting across from him was the girl he had silenced for years. She wasn't the same child he had manipulated. She wasn't the scared little girl he had threatened into silence. No, she was a young woman now. And for the first time, she was about to speak her truth in front of the world. The courtroom was packed. People who had once called Carter their spiritual leader sat in the back, their expressions unreadable. Some were still in denial, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was all some mistake. Others were silent and frozen, realizing for the first time that the man they had trusted had betrayed them all. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Prosecution, you may proceed." And just like that, the trial of Robert L. Carter began. From the moment the prosecution began laying out the case, it was clear. This wasn't going to be a trial about faith. It wasn't going to be about reputation. It wasn't even going to be about the man people thought they knew. Far from it. This was about the facts, the DNA test, the medical records, the forensic reports. Each piece of evidence was presented with precision, unshakable and undeniable. The prosecution didn't have to convince the jury that Carter was guilty. The evidence did that all on its own. But the most powerful moment was the testimony. After years of silence, the victim, the young woman who had suffered in darkness, was finally given the chance to speak. And when she took the stand, you could hear a pin drop. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice was quiet at first, but with every word she spoke, it grew stronger. She told them everything. How it started when she was just 7 years old. How he stole her innocence, one night at a time. How he made her feel powerless, isolated, terrified. how she spent years believing that no one would ever believe her, how she gave birth, alone, in a closet at 16, how he took her baby and discarded it like it was nothing. Tears streamed down the faces of some jurors. Even the judge's expression hardened. The weight of her words hung in the air, thick, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. And then, she pointed at him. "He did this to me," she said. And in that moment, Robert L. Carter had nowhere left to hide. His defense team tried everything. They tried to paint him as a victim of false accusations. They tried to question the victim's credibility. They tried to argue that the case was built on flimsy evidence. But the jury wasn't buying it. Because there was one final nail in Carter's coffin: the DNA results. When the prosecution presented them, it was over. The abandoned child was his. The girl's accusations, proven. There was no more debate, no more doubt, no more pretending. The evidence was written in blood. So, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. Robert L. Carter sat motionless, his hands clasped together. His face is unreadable. The judge looked down at the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others cried. Some shook their heads in shock. And Carter? For the first time since the trial began, his mask slipped. His face twisted. Not in remorse, not in shame, but in rage. Because this was the moment he had never expected. For years he had been untouchable. For years he had hidden behind faith. For years he had walked free. But now he was nothing more than a convicted criminal. The young woman, the one he had tried to silence, had won, partially at least, since no verdict had been given yet. And so, here we are. The truth is out. The evidence is overwhelming. The horror this young woman endured for years has been laid bare for the world to see. But justice? Justice is still hanging in the balance. Right now, Robert L. Carter sits behind bars. But there's no final verdict, no sentence, no true closure. Yet, the court proceedings are still underway, and the Harris County District Attorney's Office has remained silent about any potential plea deals. And that leaves us with a burning question. What will happen next? Will the justice system finally do the right thing, or will it fail this survivor like so many others before? But we hope the lady gets the justice she deserves. Because let's be honest, we've seen it happen. We've seen men like this walk free on technicalities, or receive weak sentences that don't match the damage they've caused. We've seen victims forced to relive their trauma in court, only for their abusers to get away with a slap on the wrist. Will this be one of those cases? Or will this no-nonsense judge handling the case ensure that justice is served? So I ask you, what do you think should happen to Robert L. Carter? Should he ever be allowed to walk free again? Should he face the maximum sentence allowed by law? Or do you believe that no punishment could ever be enough for what he's done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that needs to happen, as this case isn't over. And neither is the fight for justice. I appreciate you for joining us today. If you don't want to miss the final verdict of this case, be sure to subscribe to this channel so you can be alerted when we upload the video. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that expose the hidden evils in our world, just make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is True Crime Stories 24/7. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in our next video.